Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise of Justice Movement. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the founder and the host of the Rise of Justice Movement and the Rise of Justice Movement, the podcast. All right, today I am sitting down with Kyle, who is running for Congress in Michigan. Welcome to the podcast, Kyle.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. Walk us through who you are, walk us through your background, and why you are running for Congress.
Sure. It's probably like a lot of people's stories, right? Is you are living your everyday life. You had no plans of running for Congress until, something kind of drove you, compelled you to go and do the damn thing. An architect. I'm 40 years old from Iron Mountain, Michigan, which is in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. My I live in a small town over by the Wisconsin border. My wife Megan and I, we met in architecture school and we've been working together pretty much ever since. Her desk is actually about 6 feet to the right of mine in a small office that we share in downtown Iron Mountain. And we made it by just fine with one vehicle between the two of us for about 12 years before this whole adventure. I am used to working within my community. I've been on Iron Mountain City Council for 11 years now. I'm mayor pro tem there. And really, I had been watching throughout the course of my life as the material conditions of me and my neighbors have deteriorated, especially in the rural parts of the country, and northern Michigan is included in that. I think that we tend to feel the corrosive effects of, late stage capitalism worse and sooner than everybody else. Our communities are emptying out, our rural hospital systems are reducing services, and we're just generally seeing our prospects dwindle as you turn on the TV and you see a tremendous amount of wealth, you know, disproportionately coalescing at the top of our society. And what has kind of compelled me to run, in addition to, wanting all of my neighbors to have health care, in addition to understanding as an architect what our failed housing policy looks like in America, in addition to believing that all Americans deserve a living wage and a dignified retirement, is I was watching, as many people were, as my tax dollars were used to fund a genocide in Gaza, and that became an unsustainable and unacceptable situation in my life. And so as I was watching this race here in northern Michigan kind of develop and the candidates on either side of the ballot fill out, I wasn't seeing a single person with just the basic decency to call what is happening in Gaza a genocide and feel that our tax dollars shouldn't be subsidizing it. And so that was really what has compelled me to enter this race. And to this day, I'm the only one who has that kind of crosses that basic human threshold to call that out for what it is. In fact, the many of the other candidates will avoid it entirely. And so that's a bit about me. That's a bit about how I came to decide to run in this race here in Michigan's first district. And yeah,
Whenever I think of Michigan, I think of Rashida Tlaib. That
yes.
is the congresswoman that I mold like my like policy. And I always like whenever there's a candidate, like a progressive candidate, okay, running across the country, I always wait for her endorsement because that's gonna tell me like, okay, it's Rashida approved. I'm gonna like them. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I turned to her, for like talking about the genocide and talking about everything. Like I turn to her for, like molding my ideology because it's like if Rashida's talking about it, I need to talk about it too. Because obviously it's important. We need to address it. So thank you for being the only one to actually talk about that. It's unfortunate that you're the only one because we all should be. But, you know, as long as there's one, you know, those constituents see that. You know what I mean? So,
Well, and I'll say that I share your affection for Rashida Tlaib. I think that she
mhm.
is really perhaps the best, if not one of the best that we have in Congress. I think that she's right on every conceivable issue. The fact that she's, a member of DSA, I'm a member of DSA, it's there's definitely some congruencies there. So like you look to the real leaders, the people who are willing to stand in the breach and endure attacks not only from the right but from within their own party to do what's moral, what's just. And I think Rashida Tlaib is definitely one to do it.
Absolutely. I'm a member of the DSA myself too here in Kansas City, and they've done a lot of reorganizing and actually focusing on the needs of our communities. So it's just good to see. Now, let's kind of dive in and talk about money in politics. So I know that this is very broad and there's a lot that goes into it, but Citizens United literally stated that money and corporations is free speech. You and I both know that that's absolute bullshit. And I'll be the first to say it. Corporations are raking in record profits right now and profiting off of us. They see us as like a walking dollar sign. Every time I go to the gas pump, I know what I feel. I feel like, okay, this tank of gas is going to cost more than my cell phone bill, right? Like
Yeah.
it's insane. And I'm thinking about, who's hit hardest with this, and it's those rural communities that lack a lot of these resources, that I have here in Kansas City, right? So thinking about that, how do we address the money in politics? So obviously, overturning Citizens United by either constitutional amendment or just banning PAC money, because we see a lot of APAC corruption too. My current congresswoman is no exception to that. I have Sharif Davids.
Oh, beauty.
She is very out of touch with literally everything. I grew up in Emmanuel Cleaver's district in Missouri in Congressional District 5. So, and I believe you have somebody on your campaign, Danny, can also tell you about this stuff.
Sure.
Um, but thinking about getting money out of politics, what would that look like in your opinion, and how do we get there?
The only way to get there, really get there, is by starting with candidates that aren't taking that money, the people that are willing to call it out for what it is, which is just rank naked corruption. And I think that so many, call it centrist Democrats, will find a way to justify it, even in their own minds, that they're using those resources as a means of combating the right. But honestly, the worst effects of Citizens United aren't felt in purple races where Republicans are able to outcompete Democrats. The worst effects of Citizens United are seen in deep, deep blue districts where Republican donors are able to participate in Democratic Party primaries to ensure that by the time they get to the ballot in November, so much of our prospects have been lowered, so much of our stakes have been removed from those elections, and that you're no longer seeing the kind of candidates that would have the kind of transformative change that would really, frankly, set in a foothold for the Democratic Party nationally. And so instead, what you end up with is the same kind of captured centrist forces, and they'll use the fact that they were, the best fundraised or their electoral victory as somehow a proof of popularity or for their ideology. And really, what we're finding is that more and more people reject that premise, but because of how those forces are able to put their thumb on the scale, people are increasingly becoming disillusioned with the electoral politics. And I think that that's why you're also starting to see a rise in DSA membership, because people are starting to recognize that the end all be all is not an electoral path, that there needs to be a multi pronged approach to create resiliency within our communities and ultimately improve our prospects. But I think that the root cause of the problems with Citizens United really stem back to who you are supporting within your party primaries. And what I encourage people to do is at least have some knowledge as to your candidate's fundraising. Make sure that they are not already being funded by a corporate PAC or an organization like APAC or any special interest groups. Pay attention to these cutesy named pack groups that come in and they're called Mitten or Pleasant Peninsula or whatever. And really, once you crack it open, there's any number of special interest or corporate backers behind that additionally, right? And it's making sure that if you are going to donate a handful of dollars, like $5 or $10 to a candidate, make sure they're not already bought by any number of other forces, because at that point, all you're doing is subsidizing some billionaire's investment in your politician. And is getting people to understand that you actually have a tremendous degree of agency in this process, that all that the Citizens United decision, all that our broken campaign finance system can really do is put its thumb on the scale or propagandize you at a larger scale than the less well-funded candidates. But you still have every opportunity to research your candidates and kind of bypass that system by supporting those that have a willingness to really go further than the establishment on either party is willing to go.
I, whenever it came to, I was just telling my mom about this. Whenever it came to selecting candidates for this candidate series, right? I was like, okay, I have this podcast, I have this platform. How do I use it to the best advantage, right? And it was like this process that went in my mind. And I was like, well, corporate media is not going to share stories or share the candidates that don't align with the status quo, right? And that don't align or go against the establishment. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna turn to Rashida Tlaib, and I'm throwing it out there again. I I'm gonna see, who is she supporting? Like, she does endorsements. Like, who is she supporting? And then the other thing was, I'm looking at their platforms. I'm looking at their social media. I'm looking at people that they're interacting with. I'm looking at, their FEC filings, looking at their open secrets. And everything I found with yours is purely grassroots, which I loved. And I was like, okay, I got to reach out because this is going to be a good one. Because these are the people that I want to talk to. These are the people that I want to uplift because the corporate media is not going to uplift your campaign because you challenge the status quo. And whenever
Well,
you
and
do that,
go ahead.
oh, go ahead.
No, all I was really going to say is that honestly, I think that it is candidates like me and
Mm-hmm.
the Rashida Tlaibs of the world, or
Mm-hmm.
the Kat Abou-Ghazalehs of the world. I'll use her as an example. That actually, I think, impel a lot of that crooked money into races, if anything, because now you have a force to combat, and it's not just that those candidates in and of themselves are sympathetic to the establishment. They absolutely are. But as soon as you add a drop of populism, as soon as you add a drop of what we stand for, I think that that causes the establishment and the funding mechanism that usually backs the establishment to then kind of rally to the cause of blocking progressivism.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes down to literally getting money out of politics. And we talk about money in politics. We also need to talk about money in media because it still trickles down too. Kind of diving into your platform a little bit, let's talk about healthcare as a human right and addressing it as a human right. My mom was gaslit for many years from within the system. And unfortunately, she was diagnosed with stage 3 cervical cancer last year after those years of gaslighting. But luckily, she has a good team. She has a good set of doctors, and now she's on her road to recovery. She's kicking cancer's ass. But thinking about universal healthcare or Medicare for all, you know, we have these for-profit healthcare systems that continue to yank up the prices of healthcare, just basic healthcare. And oftentimes, those pre-existing conditions are not covered, and they typically go after anything that is like quote unquote new, right? So thinking about a universal healthcare system, single payer, Medicare for all, whichever you want to call it, thinking about that, what are some of those steps that we can take to get to Medicare for all? Because it's been introduced. Bernie Sanders is a huge champion for this, and I don't have healthcare coverage. So I'm imagining how many others do not. But thinking about that, how do we get there? What are some of the steps that we can take to recognize that healthcare is a human right?
I think that it really is just a numbers game. And unfortunately, because it's a war of attrition in those on those terms, I think that it really is. It's about boldly just naming a thing. And what I'm finding, I live in Iron Mountain, Michigan. It's a rural red county, Dickinson County is. Most of my friends that I grew up with, that I'm still friends with to this day, they don't vote like I do. They tend to trend either fully Republican or they're independents who tend to vote conservative. But I can tell you this is that more and more people, when you have discussions around healthcare cost in healthcare access, it's something that really does kind of it's a shared experience for everybody within the American working class. Either you have health insurance and it sucks, or it's paid for through your employer, but now you're tethered to that employer. You still see it coming out of your paycheck. It still is one of those factors that weighs into what your ultimate compensation is going to be, what your take home pay is going to be. And I think that more and more people are starting to recognize that we were deeply propagandized growing up. I know that I was, is this belief that Medicare for all or universal single payer health care is some kind of extreme condition or some kind of extreme system, when more and more people are being exposed to the fact that actually our system here in America, this for-profit private health insurance regime, that's the extreme. That's the outlier amongst the rest of the world. And it's causing more and more discussions with people who lean conservative to kind of end with, yeah, okay, Medicare for all, yeah, universal health care, we should do that. But, it's like they're almost starting to concede on those grounds. So why is that not the primary platform of the Democratic Party? Why can't that be something that we stand for that causes a contrast between our platforms writ large and the Republicans? And I can tell you that in my own healthcare situation, I've been subject to, call it, the economic violence of the system. I am somebody who left school with a tremendous amount of student loan debt. I'm a person who's, a small business owner, but it's a tremendously small business. It really is my wife, I, and one other person. And so my wife and I, we still to this day rely on ACA subsidies in order to pay for our health insurance. And it's understanding that when you're in the Western Upper Peninsula, you're surrounded by two things. You're surrounded by Great Lakes and you're surrounded by that Wisconsin border. And what that Wisconsin border is it's an artificial boundary that dictates that your healthcare access is limited, that I can drive 90 hours away down to Green Bay, Wisconsin to get quality care. But every single time I do that, I leave my health insurance network. And as terrible as my health insurance is and how high as my deductible is normally, now all of a sudden that doubles because I have out of network care, not because I've done anything wrong, but because these insurance monopolies have kind of parsed out our country, parted us out into states and these arbitrary boundaries. And it's getting people to understand how much is kind of capricious in that regard, that it isn't an actual real physical limitation to the system, that they are just artificial hurdles that we place between people and their care. And the entire reason for that is to maximize the profit of private health insurance companies or these large hospital systems. And it's becoming more and more recognized, not only amongst progressives, not only amongst Democrats, but amongst the greater population. And I think that it's starting to embrace that message is going to entice more people to get on board rather than, as many centrists argue, deter people who otherwise might be Democrat curious to get on board.
Yeah, absolutely. Changing hearts and changing minds by policy is something that I live by. It's something that I pride myself that I'm able to sit down and have a conversation and understand multiple sides of the issue and the issues and come up with a solution. And oftentimes I hear about healthcare. The rising cost of healthcare in the richest country is insane. It is insane to me that we're still having these conversations in 2026. But I'm glad we are because it's waking people up. And they're starting to recognize, like, yeah, this actually really is an issue. Kind of pivoting a little bit, let's talk about housing. What does housing look like in your area? And what is currently working and what's not working? Which there's a lot that can be said about this, but just curious to know what the housing looks like in your district.
I think that it's similar in our district to everywhere else, and everybody has various scaling cost of living versus wages versus job prospects and those sorts of things. Those things tend to scale not necessarily one to one, but somewhat consistently across the country, where a more expensive district also has higher wages and those sorts of things. So our biggest problem here in northern Michigan is similar to any other district in the country, and that is the lack of low end affordability, that we have failed to produce workforce housing and a launching pad for many young people or a landing point for people on a fixed income. And what I diagnose that as an architect is that we are continuing to believe that the profit motive can be satisfied and that we are going to get affordability scale out the other end. And it has not happened. In fact, it's happening at lower and lower efficiency. And what I call the root cause of that is in 1999 when Bill Clinton signs into law with bipartisan support this sweeping housing bill, and within it is the Faircloth Amendment. And the Faircloth Amendment has functionally prohibited the federal government from growing the number of public housing units that have permanent deep affordability. And we stopped doing that in 1999. And instead, what we've done is we've done what we always do, is that we have leaned on these dubious public-private partnerships where we will use tax credits as an incentive to coerce a private developer to provide some limited affordable units within our area. And it's always more costly to do it that way. And the end result is not the deep affordability that public housing ever provided, and it's not permanent. In fact, there is, through low income housing tax credits, a cliff that nobody is really having a serious conversation about, and certainly nothing that we're addressing through our federal housing policy. And that looks like that so many of our our affordable units created through a low income housing tax credit program are actually going to exit their affordability requirements within the next 10 years. So within the next 10 years, we are not only going to not be under the same regime producing the kind of housing and the unit growth that we need, but we're actually going to plateau. We're going to start to move negative. And by 2035, we're going to see about a third of our low income housing tax credit created affordable units exit affordability. And we're already in the middle of a housing crisis. We're already in an affordability crisis. And we are not going to be able to just pump profit into private developers to get the end result that we need. That we need to have kind of we need to treat this as if it is a crisis and start to divert the funds of the federal government to create public housing again, to make sure that the people who work within our communities can afford to live there. And then everything else, every other segment of the market, the market rate units, the luxury units, those will always take care of themselves. There will always be plenty of profit for people who dabble in that side of that side of the market. But we need to start taking care of regular working class people. That it shouldn't be the condition where so many of us are burdened by our housing.
I think you just said it best that it's absolutely is a burden, and it is. And oftentimes it's actually lowering the population of an area or a state, which obviously trickles down and affects the economy. It affects a number of different things because people are literally being bought out of their homes by these, I'm just going to say it, these slumlords that come in and these corporations and they drive the housing market prices so high that it runs people out of those areas. And I'm thinking like very deeply of like these rural areas. My partner grew up in southeast rural Kansas. I grew up right outside of Kansas City. And whenever those two worlds collide, it creates a whole policy platform of things that we need to focus on. And there's a common denominator is the price is too damn high. And we make it extremely hard for young people to buy their first home. I have not owned my first home and I'll be 30 years old on August 9th. I have not owned my first home yet because I've lived with my mom. We got ran out of the house that we were living in. It was a whole scenario 30 years ago. It was a lot. And we were stuck in like this limbo. It's like, well, we didn't have time to prepare to go anywhere else. So we went to a hotel, which is extremely expensive. And we're still stuck in like this housing instability crisis here in the Kansas City metro area. They supposedly capped the rent, but who are you basing that cap off of? Like, yes, we do need very strict rent control. However, we need to make sure that it's going to help these single families and the poor and the middle class and the working class, not the top 1% that doesn't have to worry about this.
Well,
So
and
it's
I think what we've done across the board is we've commoditized the necessities. We've taken the things that people absolutely need, such as healthcare and housing, and we've turned them into profit vehicles. And sometimes, especially in the case of housing, we've allowed regular working class people to kind of participate in that or feel like they're participating in that. And we did that primarily through Airbnbs or short-term rentals. What started out as maybe a person who is a snowbird or leaves an area for a period of time, being able to then rent that out more easily, has now become a business model. And because there's a handful of kind of middle class people who are able to purchase most of our fixer uppers, the ones that used to be launching pads or starter homes for people, and now they have normalized us turning those into investment vehicles for middle class people. And what we do is we hyper focus on that and say, well, we want to be able to protect those middle class people's investment. That's their American dream. We want them to be able to live that out. But what happens is that at a massive scale outside of that, through private equity, through investment hedge funds, they are participating in a way that we can't even, that is causing actual massive market shifts. And so there needs to be a limitation on the commoditization of our housing to make sure that there are enough homes for regular working class people to be able to build household wealth, because that's how we've always done it, through home ownership. And I want to make sure that we're able to reclaim that by banning private equity from coming in and affecting markets and controlling markets to that extent. And in places like northern Michigan, especially in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, we also want to make sure that those large corporations can't come in and buy a tremendous amount of our forest acreage or our Great Lakes frontage. And they are doing that increasingly. And so I believe that so much of this can come down to what kind of guardrails can we put up? What kind of fencing can we put around the American working class to be able to protect us from the outsized control and investment of billionaires and these large hedge funds?
whenever you've been out talking to people, if you've been door knocking or you've been phone banking, what are some of the concerns that you're hearing from people within your district? Obviously, I'm hearing a lot about these AI data centers, which is driving up a lot of cost across the country as far as like electricity and water, et cetera. But what are some of those other concerns that you are hearing about from constituents in your district?
I think the data centers is a massive, I think it's a salient issue. I think it is one of those issues that cuts across party lines, that whether you vote for Democrats or vote for Republicans, or you consider yourself wholly independent, or you're just politically agnostic, you don't participate in elections at all. You're seeing what data centers are starting to do in terms of overriding local will of the people, coming into communities where people vehemently do not want them, but because of the glossy one pagers and all of these promises that these AI companies are making to the municipal groups and the community leaders, they're able to kind of force those through. That's becoming a very acute topic here in Michigan because a few years ago, Gretchen Whitmer and the State House had put through these tax breaks for AI data centers to try to entice them to come into Michigan communities. And what has happened since then is that every single community on a community by community basis is forced to stand up at their county commission meetings or their city council meetings to do their best to try to kind of throw their bodies on the gear and keep these things from moving forward. But I believe completely that we need to have a moratorium on data center construction, that we can't be figuring these things out in a completely deregulated environment, not only for the data centers themselves, which will drive up our energy costs, which will they'll drink up all of our water, they'll control our so much of our municipal and county infrastructure, but also because of the deleterious effects of AI. The fact that they are largely using Americans to train the instrument of their defeat as a working individual, that they are using working people to train their AI models so that they can downsize American jobs. And I'm not anti-technology, but let's call it what it is that this is a deeply undemocratic process, that these are people with functionally infinite money coercing the system to allow them these monstrosities, and then those monstrosities aren't there to improve the lives and the efficiency and the prospects of working class individuals. They're used to replace them, and it's deeply anti-human. And until we are able to put safeguards in place to make sure that they are not overstressing our electrical grid, that they're not driving up our energy costs, that we're able to offset their demand with green energy, and that green energy is a public utility, not some public investment into a private utility monopoly. Until we're able to guarantee jobs, until we're able to pass a 32-hour work week and living wages to ensure that we don't ultimately act as internal wage competition, where increasingly we are getting laid off from our jobs and then all fighting for the leftover crumbs while they enrich themselves. Until that's the case, I do not think we should be building another data center, certainly not in northern Michigan.
Absolutely, and whenever it comes to some of the other concerns, people need okay, so let me backtrack here for a second. So there was a lot of cuts that came from the federal government. Whenever Elon Musk was in Doge, there was a lot of cuts to food stamps. There was a lot of cuts to Medicaid. There was a lot of cuts to a number of other like social programs. What about like mental health and the mental health access? What does that look like in your district? And what would you propose as far as expanding access to mental health? And yeah, let's just kind of dive into that for a second.
We have a complete lack of inpatient mental health care beds in the Upper Peninsula, certainly, but in Michigan writ large, and especially in northern Michigan. I know what that looks like, even from a municipal perspective. Like I said, I've been on Iron Mountain City Council for 11 years, and by and large, as you're going through your monthly wages and payroll, and you're seeing, oh crap, we had an overtime a glut of overtime in the police department, you can almost guarantee what that is. And that is somebody had a mental health crisis. And because we do not have the adequate infrastructure, we do not have mental health services here in the southern western Upper Peninsula, and because there is a lack of inpatient mental health care beds here in the Upper Peninsula, what that looks like is that two of our officers at Iron Mountain Police Department have to sit on an individual during their crisis at a local ER until they are able to transport them. And then those two police officers act as glorified orderlies, transporting somebody from the Upper Peninsula to some place downstate where they can find a bed or find some facility to get care but that's deeply inhumane to the person who's in the middle of that crisis. And it's ultimately a draw on so many of our municipal resources. And I think it's another example of how our society tends to pay for things one way or the other. It's just how we pay for things. Are we being proactive? Are we actually treating the symptoms of somebody? Are we actually caring for our people? Or are we only punishing them? Or are we only transporting the costs from the state and federal government to local governments? And I think that that's a perfect example. I think that we need a tremendous amount more mental health care facilities throughout the country. And what I see as an expansion or an addition to Medicare for all is hell, I've seen my rural hospital systems lose services the entirety of my life. That the big beautiful bill accelerated that, but it really was just accelerating a process that had already begun under our for-profit healthcare regime. And so when I see areas where a private hospital company has come in and bought all of the nodes of care, and then they decide that they're going to make it more cost efficient for them, and they're going to pull a node offline, they're going to close a clinic, and they're going to try to drive the patients that would otherwise go to that clinic to the neighboring clinics that they also own. I say, no, that's bullshit. I think that the federal government, in areas where a private corporation has deemed our care unprofitable for them, that we need to be able to fill those nodes of care with publicly run, publicly owned and operated facilities as a public service to the people that live there. And I think that that extends absolutely to mental health care facilities in places like rural northern Michigan.
Being on the city council and being the mayor pro tem, what are some of the causes and some of the legislation that you have led, and how has like your like personal experience like influenced those decisions? I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It does. I think that it's the little things. When you're in a city like Iron Mountain, you don't have a lot of resources to be able to do, to go off on call them crusades or fix so much of the things that state and federal government have failed to do. So much of your job is just kind of keeping the lights on and making sure that you are going through the general process of government, making sure the roads are plowed, that we can build as many sidewalks or treat as many alleys as possible, that we can switch to recycling locally, that we can do any number of other things. But I think that there is so many times where the long pauses where you're literally just kind of keeping the lights on are punctuated with moments of humility. They're punctuated with moments of humanity, and a few kind of stick out in my mind is, we were watching the situation that came out of the murder of George Floyd. And I know that there are people within my community who wanted to see something done, and it's important for somebody to say something. And so even in 2021 or 2020, I can't recall which, I put forth a resolution to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter here in Iron Mountain. And it was put before a council that was largely conservative, but I was able to get that passed with unanimously. The only fight to it really was any number of people who wanted to include language that wanted to address any of the violence coming out of it. But what I explained to people is that this is the way that our society lets off steam. And if you cannot redress the grievances of people, you cannot give them reform, then they are forced to lash out against the system that has abused them. And our system is terribly abusive, especially to people of color, especially the various different marginalized groups. And so it's getting people to understand that this is not an infringement on your rights. This is not handicapping the system away from you. This is just adjusting for a system that is deeply brutal to those that are most vulnerable to it. And then another one was we had a project that was proposed for low income housing tax credits. And I have my critiques of the low income housing tax credit program, but it was proposed for a defunct middle school here in Iron Mountain. And we have an absolute need for low income housing. And I don't think that this was going to address the needs as efficiently as possible, but it definitely was going to be a start. And it was deeply disheartening to see how regular working class people will turn against their own, that we will additionally stratify our own class so that we can look down on others and that we can start to project any number of criticisms upon people who just make a few dollars less than us, right? And we're not very much further apart than that, that a single mother that requires a Section 8 housing voucher is infinitely closer to you than you are to a billionaire. And I think that there's moments like that when the community can either come together or you can watch it kind of tear itself apart. And it's instructive to at least say, we need class solidarity above all else, that we cannot continue to subdivide the American working class into additional tiers of income. We can't continue to stratify us in terms of our blue collars and white collars, that we need to start to see our shared humanity and push that thing forward. And I see that bore out every single day on Iron Mountain City Council. And even though I am, identify as a democratic socialist, even though I am far to the left politically of anybody else that I've ever served with, even though for a large portion of my time on city council, I remained the youngest person, I have earned the respect of people who disagree with me ideologically, politically, because I am able to speak through that party's partisan nonsense and speak to that shared humanity.
On your website, you talk about you would join efforts to abolish ICE. What has ICE looked like in your area? So I know you live in not necessarily by like the big metro like Detroit, but has there been any concern about ICE raids in your area? What does it look like? And has the community organized around it? And then obviously, yes, ICE absolutely needs to be abolished. It's very obvious that they are Donald Trump's private force, essentially. And that is something that needs to be addressed. So, as far as abolishing ICE, what has it looked like in your area?
There have been ICE sightings, there have been ICE actions within our district. It is a huge, huge district. It's for those that don't know, it's 44% of Michigan. It's massive. It is the second largest district, I think, east of the Mississippi, and the other one doesn't have Great Lakes to contend with. So it's varied, it's diverse. Our big cities aren't our largest cities aren't big cities, but we definitely have some of that. But I think that more than anything, it's understanding that at one point or another, we are going to be asked to make a decision. And right now we have any number of facilities. There's a defunct prison out in Montonagan that one Republican lawmaker in the state has proposed be retrofitted to be an ICE detention facility, that when people in communities in northern Michigan are given the choice between having a deeply immoral and societally inefficient structure like an ICE detention facility, or being impoverished, when you're constantly have that sort of Damocles, that there's structural violence of poverty hanging over your head, you're constantly forced to weigh your integrity as a human being or your natural resources for a few short-term jobs. And so we're starting to see proposals for ICE detention facilities creep into our district. But I think it's also getting on people to understand that any federal dollars that are exported from northern Michigan to the federal government that go towards ICE enforcement actions is a waste. it is a net loss to you as a citizen. And it's getting people to recognize that this is all in service of what I call an immigration hysteria. That too often I think the Democratic Party capitulates to the right wing framing on immigration, that they will capitulate on the idea that immigrants are a net tax loss when all data points show that they are create a net tax surplus. In fact, if we did not have undocumented immigrants, that we would our national debt would be about 50% higher. We capitulate to economic forces when our industries, whether that be agriculture or construction or what have you, service industry, that those rely on undocumented immigrants to make sure that we have the workforce that we need. What we don't require is we don't require them to remain second class citizens, that we can make them citizens relatively easily. And that so much of the immigration process or the lack of a sound pathway to citizenship is really a broken promise on behalf of the US government. And that we can start keeping those promises and giving those people an actual pathway to citizenship. And when I look at when INS, before INS was hastily reorganized into the what we now call Department of Homeland Security, ICE, and CBP now, it used to oversee our immigration process under the Department of Justice. It was a process of vetting future citizens. We saw them for their economic value, for their cultural value, and for their inherent humanity. And we used to do that for about $4 billion a year. Now, fast forward, and we have ICE and CBP running at $75 billion a year. You have them going into our communities, brutalizing our immigrant brothers and sisters, as well as US born citizens. And it's all done at this as part of this security theater. I want to start calling that what it is. It's a hysteria. But this is not meant to counteract crime because undocumented or immigrants writ large commit crimes at a lower rate than US born citizens. The sooner we can acknowledge that that is a hysteria, the sooner we can start speaking to the facts and addressing those facts, cutting down that immigration enforcement apparatus, starting to spend those monies elsewhere, including vetting and creating pathways to citizenship for people who have been here working, contributing to society, and creating an organization within our federal government that embraces immigrants because it is a cultural and economic value.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for talking about it too. So, whenever we continue on and we continue, going through your platform, this is a very comprehensive platform. And you can tell that it comes from like an actual like ideological standpoint and not just saying, oh, you know, I believe in this, I believe in this, I believe in this. I've talked to so I think I need to stop talking at this point. But I've talked with other candidates, and there's been a couple candidates that I have interviewed that I did not end up using their interview because it's like you talk about that you care about this, but then I ask you a question about it and you didn't emphasize on it. It's like it's directly from your platform. And this isn't me, saying, oh, they're a terrible candidate because they still have a perfect platform, but it's like you didn't expand on it. You know what I mean? And it's like platforms are more than just a platform. This is like what you're actually going to do for the constituents of your district. This is where it truly matters. People are looking at these websites, and I mean, I do. Whenever I see somebody pop up on a ballot, I'm like, oh, I get curious. And I start looking at their platform and I'm like, oh, they believe in what I believe in. Okay, great. And then I reach out and request a meeting with them and just to kind of like get to know them and see who they are. I know not everybody does that. They see an R or a D after the name and well, that's who they go with, right? But you talk about invest in people, not punishment. Meeting people's needs is the most effective way to improve society and prevent crime. The US spends nearly 3 times as much to imprison people as it does to educate them. I'll support substantial criminal justice and prison reform, including reducing sentencing, humane conditions, reintegration programs, and ending prison slavery, and shrinking America's prison population to men's communities. As somebody who was on probation for 5.5 years, from the age of around like 13, like 12 or 13 until I was 18, being a smart ass teenager, it was not easy to stay out of trouble because one little false move and I would have went into juvenile. And that was the reality of that. It was for an assault charge that I did not commit. But thinking about the state of the prison industrial complex and the for-profit systems, what are some of the steps that you would take as far as criminal justice and prison reform? Kind of like I said, you talked about it a little bit, but let's expand on that.
Sure. I think that there are any number of ways. The blueprint is not, it's not something that we have to devise ourselves. I think that so much of it starts by looking at mandatory minimum sentencing, looking at the punishment structure that we have built within our policing, and understanding that we have created now that in the advent of for-profit prisons, we have created a market that incentivizes the continued imprisonment of our own population. But there's no reason that America, with I think less than 3 or 4% of the world's population, should have 25% of its incarcerated individuals. I think that is the sign of a deeply sick society. And I think that now we're seeing that expand into these immigrant detention facilities. So long as there is these for-profit apparatuses whereby it is more it is more attractive to our lawmakers who are paid for by those entities to lock people up and disenfranchise them than it is to care for their basic needs. I think that that's a screwed up way of approaching anything. So much of it is understanding that we don't have to do these things. We don't have to put so many people in jail. So reducing our sentencing, but also starting to address the underlying conditions that people do not commit crimes as an act of opportunity or greed. That so much crime is a crime of desperation, and that if you just met those people's needs within their own communities, that you would see a marked drop in the rate of crime and the rate of certainly incarceration. I look at homelessness as an example, is that just because there's such a congruency to it, is you look at the amount of money that it would take to meaningfully address homelessness in America, and it's usually accepted at like 20 billion. Like for $20 billion, we can largely eradicate homelessness in the country. We spend about $20 billion a year policing, adjudicating, and jailing people for lack of housing or mental health care facilities, that we could usually spend that same amount of money to just address somebody's needs and keep them out of that system. Then when it comes to actual carceral reform, I think that we need to be able to invest more in our prisons, not in the sense that we are growing their population, but we need to be able to make it a more humane, rehabilitating environment. That I look at a lot of our we have uh, prison systems and jails here in northern Michigan, and so many of our corrections officers are overburdened. They have too many inmates as their responsibility. I would rather that we have more humane facilities that have less uh, that have less um, inmates, and that those same staff are better equipped so that those inmates, that population can start to dwindle. That we cannot have this constant recidivism where people are brought back into the prison system because the parole system does not allow them to escape it. I think that there's so much clemency that we can add to that system to be able to shrink it. And I think shrinking it is a moral imperative. I think it's necessary for us. It's shameful that we should hold so much of the world's incarcerated people, breaking up our communities, diverting so much of our funds to this punishment apparatus that really is self-defeating.
I've spent the last couple of weeks doing a series with the death penalty action, and we're covering the death penalty from the beginning to the end, or I guess not necessarily end, but we're covering it, and I'm learning more and more about it. And the more I learn about it, the more fucked up I realize it actually is. And I just think about it, and I think about some of the steps that Congress has taken to reform the criminal justice system. And it's one of those things like, do we feel that we can truly reform this, or do we need to start from the ground up? I go back and forth because, like, there's a lot that we can do, but there's a lot more that we can't do because those systems were not built for people like you and me. So I think about that, and yeah, it's a sometimes it feels like a lost cause, and sometimes it feels like we're not going to get it to function the way it needs to. We just need to burn the whole damn thing down and rebuild it. But I realize we're still in a capitalistic for-profit system, and we got to do what we got to do. But there is a lot of reforms that we can do, and we need to get people in there that are willing to actually do it and stand up against these corporations. Because Core Civic owns a lot of the ICE concentration camps as well as the prisons across the country.
Yeah, and I think that like you said, that there's that incentive structure that it's very difficult to. It's the reason why there is less of a legislative will to actually address it. And I share your frustrations. I really do. I mean, I think that a lot of the way I joke is I say that, finally deciding to run for Congress is kind of like electoralism leaving your body, right? Is that it's the last desperate act of someone who is starting to lose utter faith that the system can be reformed. And I think that you look at the prison system as an example, is like it they've built this cumbersome apparatus that is it's this knot that we need to untie one loop at a time, and it is seemingly tighter and tighter and more complex every single year instead of the opposite. And abolition always seems like it is just a if you had it all to start over fresh today, you wouldn't make one of 100 mistakes that we've made along the way. And so I absolutely sympathize with that instinct for sure.
Absolutely. And whenever we talk about, you know, things that would need to change, obviously getting the money out of politics is obviously the number one thing to get people elected like you that understand how complex these issues are facing our communities, because this is not linear. This is very complex because there's multiple moving parts in it. There's multiple different things. Whenever we think about mass incarceration, we cannot overlook the root cause, which oftentimes is poverty. Whenever we think about gun violence, we think about poverty. We think about mental health. We think about the upbringing in which people are facing in their communities. The homicide rate in Kansas City nearly tripled the previous year, last year. And that is a systemic failure, and it's a policy choice, and it is preventable. Whenever we think about addressing anything, it's a policy choice. It all comes down to that policy and getting people in there that understand, again, how complex these issues are that are facing our communities. So, my last question to you is veterans. So, whenever it comes to the VA, whenever it comes to obviously expanding, veteran benefits, what are some of the steps that you would take to recognize our veterans and support the needs of the veteran community?
That's a great question. Well, we have an outsized veteran community here in northern Michigan. I can't remember what the exact number is, but it is such an outsized portion of our population. Here in Iron Mountain, we're very lucky to have a state-of-the-art VA hospital, and that calls in so many of the veterans from outside of the area. I've talked to my father-in-law, who is a former service member who has a VA benefit, and he has told me that, the VA here in Iron Mountain is one of the best, if not the best, that he's ever been to. But there's no that there might be a lack of consistency from one facility to the other, whether you're in Iron Mountain or Milwaukee or Chicago, that because of how that system is burdened, because really, while it is a separate lane, it isn't always the best lane. And I want the best care, especially for our service veterans. And I think that in order to provide that care, you need to make sure that you preserve it first and foremost. I think that so much of what we're seeing in our current representative and his sycophancy towards Donald Trump is that there are efforts afoot to start to cut up and privatize portions of the VA so that they can basically undermine the collective bargaining abilities of the people that work for the VA so that they can start to sell those off for parts to their donors, their benefactors, so that they can start to increasingly prey upon our service veterans. So I think that we should be expanding services and that we should be keeping them as a function of the federal government rather than privatizing them. I think that we should make more facilities available throughout the region so that we don't have veterans having to travel too far. I think that it's a sorry state of the world where we are unable to keep the promises to our service veterans, and that so many of them are left behind, that they're not getting the mental health care that they deserve and need, that they are living on the streets in places like northern Michigan where we have tremendously harsh winters, that we don't have the eyes on those veterans like we would like to so that we can meet their needs. But it's also starting to understand that I want less and less people who are suffering from the deleterious effects of their service. That I don't want a military apparatus that, because it is an incentive structure to create war and conflict around the world, that we need to always sell our weapons so that we can replenish them and grow the military budget, so that we can enrich these weapons manufacturers. I don't want American service members stuck in that on that carousel. I want to make sure that the next generation of people who are wounded combat veterans or people with PTSD, that population is less and less and is more manageable. And I also want to flatten the system with programs like Medicare for All so that we are all subject, that our care is universal, comprehensive, and inclusive, and that we don't have these separate lanes for our service members that ultimately are just in many cases separate, not better, or separate, not adequate.
Absolutely. My last question to you. First of all, thank you for allowing me to talk about veterans. And not necessarily allowing me to talk about veterans, but thank you for being knowledgeable about this specific issue. And I mentioned veterans to a couple of different people outside of the series, and I'm like, oh, they get better health care than anybody else. No, they do not. And that is a misconception. They do not. That is a very high misconception. Now, my last question to you is how can people contribute to your campaign and how can they uplift the work that you are doing?
I think that I think the best way to help us would be with a monetary donation. Any small gift that you'd be willing to give to our campaign, even if it's just a few dollars, it helps us get around. Like I said, it's a massive district. So you can, if you want to donate to our campaign, or if you're willing to volunteer to our campaign, whether you're in the district, whether in the state of Michigan or outside, we are going to have a lot of volunteer opportunities, especially in phone banking. The nature of our district is that it is a largely inefficient process to get to the far-flung areas of our district. There's 36 counties in our district, and they vary from relatively populated in Marquette or Grand Traverse to some more far-flung areas where you might just have a handful of doors every few miles. And so if you're willing to contribute your dollars or times to this campaign, go to blomquistforcongress.com. There you'll also find a link to all of our social media. We're very active on all of our social media, but especially, if I want to shoot off something, a thought real quick, I'm usually on Twitter. It's a hellscape, but it's the avenue, it's the arena in which we need to participate. And I would encourage people to contribute and look for candidates like me throughout the country. There's several here in the state of Michigan that I would encourage people to support. I would encourage people to support Abdul Al-Sayed in the U.S. Senate race here in Michigan. I would encourage them to certainly contribute to people like Rashida Tlaib, even though she doesn't need my help up in here in the Upper Peninsula, but individuals like Will Lawrence in the Lansing area, or Diop Harris, who is in the fourth district, or Donovan McKinney, who's in the 13th. There is a coalition, there's a building movement of people like us who believe like we do, who are looking to not only overcome Republicans, but to overcome the toxic inertia that we have here in the Democratic Party. And I think overcoming that establishment stranglehold on our politics is going to get us not only better outcomes in our elections, but better outcomes in our lives.
Absolutely, Kyle. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. I greatly appreciate you, and I look forward to calling you Congressman. So excited.
Hell yeah, hell yeah.
I'm manifesting it. I'm putting it into the world. Now let's make it happen. If you are listening and you are in this district, please get out and vote for Kyle. And you heard it from him. Also, Will Lawrence, Donovan McKinney, and like you said, there's a whole coalition that is building. I've been working with citizens impeachment to identify candidates that I would love to bring on this podcast. A lot of them have come directly from that, and that's what it takes. It takes that coalition building. It takes challenging the status quo, going against the corrupt leadership on both sides of the aisle. And with that, Kyle, again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Take care of yourself, okay?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, and have a great day.
Absolutely. Thank you.